Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we're going to continue our series on all of the magic item changes in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide for the new rule set for Dungeons & Dragons. I started this series about a week ago. I'm going to put everything in a playlist so that you'll be able to watch it if you're discovering it late back to back if you're just kind of interested in this sort of thing, or at least so you have it all in one place. That'll be linked down in the description down below, as well as in my channel page. But before we get started with that, if you are a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you see here, please consider hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already. I really appreciate all your guys' support. I know that they actually just released a new Unearthed Arcana for some new subclasses or revised subclasses. I'll have to get to that one this weekend, so I'm aware of it. I'll just have to get to it because I kind of dropped it as I was working on this one. But that'll at least give me time to sort of read through everything and sort of ingest all the changes and be able to make some better commentary and all that sort of stuff. So you have that to look forward to this weekend, but let's get to the magic item changes. I'm starting with the Circlet of Blasting. So the Circlet of Blasting, the only changes here is that it no longer states that it requires an action, but this is implied by the fact that you're casting a spell, and as a result this technically now would require the magic action from an action. The item itself, of course, doesn't require a specific action to activate, but you are casting a spell which requires an action, which specifically in this case would be the magic action. We're going to see this sort of pattern very frequently throughout the first handful of items in this video, so be ready to hear that sort of repeated a few times. Moving on to the Cloak of Arachnida. The changes here is that the climb speed is just equal to your speed rather than just your walking speed. Much like the Circlet of Blasting, it no longer states that it requires an action to cast the web spell, but of course this is implied by the act of casting a spell, and as a result, much like the Circlet of Blasting, this now requires a magic action because it is casting a spell from an action. Moving on to the Cloak of Billowing. This was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. When you cause the cloak to billow, this now lasts for 1 minute, whereas previously it didn't have a specified duration. For the Cloak of Displacement, the properties of this cloak are now suppressed while your move speed is 0, whereas previously in 2014 this was while you were incapacitated, restrained, or otherwise unable to move. Notably, this means that you do not lose this effect if you are only incapacitated now, because the incapacitated condition in 2024 does not reduce your movement speed to 0. For the Cloak of Elvenkind, the effects of this cloak are now always active while wearing it, whereas previously you had to use an action to pull the hood up or down, and it now gives you advantage on all dexterity stealth checks, whereas previously this was only dexterity stealth checks made to hide, not necessarily to move silently or whatever that check might be entailing. For the Cloak of Invisibility, so this has a few changes to go through. First things first, it now has 3 charges, and you regain 1d3 charges, which is just 1d6 divided by 2 rounded up, daily at dawn. This used to have a total of 2 hours of use within a 12-hour period. It now requires a magic action to pull the hood up or down, whereas previously this was just an action. Each charge lasts 1 hour, whereas previously you could use this for up to 2 hours at a time within a 12-hour period, like I just mentioned. And then you used to be able to gain 1 hour of use after not using it for a period of 12 hours. So if you wanted to get that 2 hours back, you would technically not need to use it for a whole day. If you wanted to get just 1 hour back to use it, you would need to wait 12 hours to do so. And now pulling down the hood to disable the effect now requires no action, whereas previously this required an action. So on the surface, this might seem like a nerf, or maybe it's unclear, but in the previous version in 2014, you were never going to get more than 3 hours of use out of this cloak anyway, and that would require you to use it for at least an hour or 2 hours, stop using it for 12 hours during that day, and then use it again after that 12 hours was up. And then at that point you'd used all the charges and you would need to wait at least 24 hours to even use it again. Now you could technically just use it for 3 hours straight, expending all 3 charges 1 hour at a time. You might have to hide for a moment to take the time to reactivate it real quick. You don't necessarily get all of the charges back at dawn. It is possible that you only get 1 charge back, but that is a 2 out of 3 chance to get at least 2 charges back or even 3 charges, whereas previously you would have needed to wait 24 to 36 hours to get the same amount of time back. So overall this feels a lot better. It's definitely a lot more versatile as to how you can use it and when you can use it and for how long you can use it. You're generally going to get just more use of this item than you would have previously on a day-to-day basis. For the Cloak of Many Fashions, this again was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Xanathar's Guide to Everything had a lot of common magic items that were in that book. Most of the common magic items are mainly just flavor. A lot of them now were added to the Dungeon Master's Guide. This particular one was unchanged. For the Cloak of Protection, this one was also unchanged. For the Cloak of the Bat, again, very similar to the other magic items we saw at the start of this video. This no longer states that it requires an action to cast the polymorph spell, but again, this is implied by the casting of a spell, so this also would require the magic action rather than just an action. For the Clockwork Amulet, again, this was another common item added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. This one is also unchanged, although I think this is maybe one of the most, I hesitate to call it a busted common magic item because it is still just a common magic item. But again, like I said, most of the common magic items in the game are just flavor, like the Billowing Cloak just kind of makes you look cool for a little while. The Gleaming Armor just kind of always looks shiny. This one allows you to take 10 on an attack roll. Once per long rest, a 10 on the die, so it's 10 plus whatever your modifiers are. So when you're in a combat and you've kind of figured out what the enemy's AC is and you're like, okay, I need to hit this time and I know I need at least a 10 to do it, you can just take 10 on that roll and just guarantee that you're going to hit them. So that's actually pretty good, and especially considering that this item doesn't require attunement. Moving on to the Clothes Amending, another common item that was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, also unchanged. For the Crystal Ball, this one was also unchanged, although notably, and this was kind of annoying to me as I was going through making these videos, the text for the legendary versions of this item in this particular description of the very rare version of it haven't been updated in D&D Beyond. However, there are separate entries for it, so you can see these here. There are no changes to the Crystal Ball of True Seeing, but for the Mind Reading and Telepathy variants, again, very similar to all the other items that let you cast a spell. It no longer states that it requires an action to do so, but of course this is implied by the act of casting a spell, and of course this would make that action a magic action from just a regular action, as it would have been in 2014. Moving on to the Cube of Force. So this item has been pretty significantly changed. So to begin with, this no longer requires an action to activate, which would again require the magic action, or in this case, it's going to assume the action type of the spell that you're casting, because one of these spells here is Shield, which is of course a reaction. It now has 10 charges down from 36. It regains 1d6 charges daily at dawn down from 1d20. It now allows you to cast a certain spell from the cube rather than gaining basically variable levels of protection against external forces per charge that you spent. This is basically building up to like sort of like a wind wall effect, and then it would slowly build up to basically just being like casting Wall of Force. And then speaking of Wall of Force, if you spend 5 charges, you just cast Wall of Force, which is very similar to the effect of using 5 charges on the 2014 version of the Cube of Force. And one of the reasons for the changes to the number of charges and the amount of charges that you get back is that this item no longer loses charges when it's targeted by certain spells or effects. I don't know if that's really, as effective as it was. I mean, in those circumstances, it certainly is, but the kind of spells or effects that could cause this item to lose charges, you probably weren't going to come across them very often unless the DM was specifically putting them in your way. That wasn't the case, and you probably got a lot of uses out of this spell. However, I do like the changes to the spell. Again, Shield is obviously an amazing spell that is, up to 10 casts of Shield per day as long as you're holding onto the item. Lehman's Tiny Hut, even though it's nerfed a little bit, it's still good. Mordenkainen's Private Sanctum, even better for long rests. Odaluk's Resilient Sphere, not bad. And of course, Wall of Force is always good. So overall, there's been adjustments to the amount of charges. I do like the greater flexibility in this one. Moving on to the Cube of Summoning. This is new to the Dungeon Master's Guide in 2024. For an item that doesn't require attunement, a free level 5 summon with no concentration once per long rest is nothing to scoff at. I did have a video released already about all the new magic items in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I do go into them more in detail there. Maybe I'll link it down in the description if I remember to do so. Otherwise, you can just go and search it on my channel. For the Cubic Gate, this is now a magic action to activate from an action. And then Plane Shift no longer has a set DC because the Plane Shift in 2024 no longer can be used offensively as a type of banishment. And, some of you who have been maybe paying more attention might be suddenly wondering, why does this item that ultimately just casts a spell also require a magic action? Other items that also cast spells don't. So I had that very same question, so I had to kind of go back and compare this item to the other items that kind of operated in a similar way. So for example, we started with the Circlet of Blasting that just grants the wearer the ability to cast a spell at any time once per long rest. It is not something that needs to be activated. Just wearing the Circlet of Blasting grants you the ability to cast a spell once per long rest. So that's why it doesn't have a specific magic action to activate, because you don't need to do anything to the item itself to activate that effect. But then I looked at the Cube of Force that we just went over, and this one doesn't require a magic action, but you still need to interact with it in order to cast one of those spells. However, I'm pretty sure that's only because that one of these spells that you can cast is Shield. So in that case, as I sort of mentioned on that slide, the action that is necessary to use that item is inherited by the spell that you're casting. So it will be, of course, a magic action for things like Lehman's Tiny Hut and Mordenkainen's Private Sanctum and Wall of Force, but it would be a reaction to cast Shield. That's why it can't be a magic action to activate that item, because one of the spells is a reaction. And this is also covered by the rules for spells cast from items in the Dungeon Master's Guide, where it says the spell uses its normal casting time, range, and duration, and the user of the item must concentrate if it requires concentration. certain potions and other effects might bypass these requirements, but if it's not mentioned, then it does follow those rules. But then for the Cubic Gate, even though both of these spells do require the magic action to cast in the first place, requiring the magic action to actually activate the item means that the item needs to be in your hands. You need to be able to actually interact with it. So it can't just be like on your person on the side or sort of in your pouch. You need to actually be holding it to interact with it, which is why it requires that magic action. So the magic action is sort of an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of different kinds of actions, whether it be casting a spell or using a magic item or using a special feature from your class that requires a magic action. There's a number of certain different ways that the magic action can essentially be implemented, and so that's why there's these sort of minute changes between the different items. So all that aside, let's go ahead and move on to the next item. So we have Darren's Instant Fortress. So this is a magic action to activate from an action. It can now have a staircase or ramp between levels, whereas previously this was only a ladder. So if your character's in a wheelchair, for example, they can now get a ramp up to the second level. It no longer states that it has a protection from Chime of Opening, but this is implied because, as we saw in the last video, the Chime of Opening now just basically casts the knock spell, and this has immunity from the knock spell. No longer states any specific mechanics for what happens if you activate this item while creatures are in the space that this fortress would extend into, whereas previously in 2014 it said in the description that if creatures were in that space, they would need to make a DC 15 dexterity saving throw, or they would take 10d10 bludgeoning damage, saving for half. Notably, it also doesn't say that creatures are just pushed out of the way, so I guess that would kind of be for the DM to adjudicate what happens if that would occur. It does now say that it has an AC of 20, whereas previously this didn't have an armor class of any kind. It is immune to bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing damage, whereas previously this was just immune to all non-magical damage. And it now regains all of its hit points when the wish spell is used to repair it, whereas previously this only regained 50 hit points when that happened. Interestingly, there's a small bit of inconsistency with the fact that the fortress only has a 20 AC because it is made out of adamantine, and I recently made a video about breaking objects, specifically as it relates to breaking weapons and armor in 5th edition, and in the rules for breaking object, it states that adamantine is supposed to have an AC of 23, so they kind of nerfed the AC on the fortress here. Moving on to the Dagger of Venom. This is now a bonus action to apply the poison, whereas previously this was just an action. This also now has the Nick Mastery in 2024 because it is a dagger. And I think the Nick Mastery is actually pulling a lot of weight for this weapon. Not only does it free up your bonus action when making attacks with 2 light weapons, but it also allows you to apply the poison from this item without sacrificing that offhand attack as well. So you can still only use it once per long rest, which feels kind of weak for me. A Flame Tongue weapon is also rare and it can be used unlimited amount of times. This does have a +1 bonus, but I think this could use some charges or something. I still think it's not a bad item. It's a cool item. I just think it could be better even at this rarity. Moving on to the Dancing Sword. This no longer requires a command word when you toss it into the air. It's just a bonus action to do so. Now states that it falls into your space when it tries to return to your hand, but you have no hands free, whereas previously it just said at your feet. I don't know if that really means anything mechanically, but I just wanted to point that out. And because it is a weapon, it now comes with whatever mastery is associated with its weapon type. Because it has to be a sword, it is going to be limited to Vex, Nick, Sap, and Graze. There might be some debate as to whether masteries would apply to the dancing weapon because you're not holding it, because most of the mastery properties do say if you hit or if your attack hits or something along those lines. Personally, I'd allow it, especially considering that it only attacks and moves under your control, and it uses your attack bonus for the attack rolls and damage rolls of the weapon. Moving on to the Dark Shard Amulet. This was again added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. It no longer describes the material that it is made from as extraplanar. It says that it is from an otherworldly realm rather than from the realm of your Warlock patron. It now requires a magic action to activate, whereas previously this had no activation requirement. This can now only be used with cantrips that have a casting time of an action, whereas previously this was any cantrip on the Warlock spell list. So this would notably not apply to the Magic Stone cantrip. I can't remember if that's on the Warlock spell list, but I assume it would be. For the Decanter of Endless Water, this is now a magic action to activate from an action. The effect of the geyser is now defined explicitly as a line, whereas this was previously implicit from the dimensions of the description. Aiming the geyser now no longer requires any action, whereas previously it required a bonus action to do so. So you would have to activate the item as an action and then bonus action aim it at a creature. And also objects targeted by the geyser can no longer be pushed up to 15 feet away. Upon first reading the geyser, it almost felt like you could basically use this like a sprinkler and just kind of spin in a circle, since you don't need to use a bonus action to aim it anymore. But I feel like the intention here is that the aiming happens as part of the same magic action to activate the item, and it also describes that you can only target one creature with that effect. However, it doesn't really address the fact that the geyser would continue to keep coming out until the start of your next turn. So there still is an ongoing persistent effect, even though you can only target one creature with the geyser effect. So if I had this in my game, I would probably only allow them to affect one creature with it on their turn, but otherwise consider it a continuous effect if any creature would be moved into that space or move into that space willingly. Moving on to the Deck of Illusions. This one is a three-parter. The Deck of Illusions is now a magic action to activate from an action. It now creates an illusion of a creature, whereas previously this said one or more creatures, and we'll get to why that is in a second. It now instructs the user to roll on the Deck of Illusions table to randomly determine which creature is chosen, whereas previously this was suggested to use a deck of playing cards to emulate that instead. It is now also a magic action to move an existing illusion from an action. Investigating an illusion, much like every other illusion effect in the game, now requires the study action from just a regular action, and it also now suggests that dispel magic and other effects can dispel the illusion. As for the kinds of illusions that you can get with this item, that's on the following table. So for the first half of this table, we start with seeing that the Archmage no longer comes with mage apprentices. So we remember on the previous slide that I now said is it comes with one illusion rather than one or more illusions. That's why, because nothing comes with buddies anymore. Similarly, the Bandit Captain no longer has 3 bandits. The Bugbear Warrior, the Gnoll Warrior, and the Goblin Warrior are now specifically referring to specific creature types of those creatures. This is because in the new monster manual, as they've described in their pre-release video, they've expanded the kinds of creatures within certain creature types, so there isn't just a regular goblin anymore. There's a goblin warrior or a goblin booyog or a goblin whatever. There's different kinds of goblins. And then at the bottom of the first half of this list, we can see that there's a guardian naga, so this is new to this list. That wasn't there before. And then moving on to the second half, similarly to the first half, we see that there's a Hobgoblin Warrior and a Kobold Warrior and a Veteran Warrior. Again, specific creature types for creature types that were expanded upon in the new monster manual. The Incubus is no longer paired with the Succubus, and if you go down a little further, you can see that the Succubus is no longer paired with the Incubus, so they are taking up 2 separate slots. The Knight no longer comes with 4 guards. The Oni is new to the list. The Priest no longer comes with 2 acolytes, and the Wyvern is also added as a new creature to this list. The only thing that was removed from the previous list in 2014 is the Ogre Mage. Moving on to the Deck of Many Things, maybe the most famous or infamous or both item in the game of Dungeons & Dragons. To begin with, this now has a random table that uses dice rolls to determine the outcomes rather than relying on a deck of cards. And because the Jester and the Fool cards don't reappear back in the deck after you use them, it does instruct you to re-roll if you get that same result. So moving on to the actual result table. The D&D Beyond table is a little wonky. It doesn't include the word moon for the moon result. The card for the Idiot in 2014 was renamed to Puzzle, and the card for the Vizier in 2014 was renamed Sage. So on the left-hand side, you can then see that they have the 2 columns. Each is a D100 roll. One is for the 13-card deck, one is for the 22-card deck. I'm a little sad that they still don't have a column for the cards that are associated with it if we still wanted to do that. Obviously, that's still in the old Dungeon Master's Guide, and in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 2024, they didn't have enough room in that column anymore to include that, so a little sad, but it still exists in the old one. So then we're going to move on to the actual descriptions of what each card does. So starting with balance, balance has completely changed. You used to flip your alignment to whatever the opposite was, so lawful became chaotic and good became evil and vice versa. If you had a neutral alignment in any position, that would not change. Now in 2024, it allows you to increase one of your ability scores up by 2 up to 22, as long as you also reduce one of your ability scores by 2 down to no lower than 5. Moving on to the Comet, this one has also completely changed, where it used to give you a whole level's worth of experience if you single-handedly defeated the next monster or group of monsters that you came across. It now lets you choose a single creature in the next combat that you go into against hostile creatures, and then if you specifically reduce that creature to 0 hit points, you gain advantage on death saving throws for 1 year. Anyone else reduces that creature to 0 hit points, then the card has no effect. So if you get the Deck of Many Things and you get this effect, you definitely want to kind of call out and let people know that you need to get the killing blow on that specific creature. And then for the last of changes on the features shown here, the Donjon no longer carries artifacts with you into the extra dimensional prison. Rather, they drop to the ground in the space where you disappeared from. Moving on to the next series of changes here. So the Fool, this now grants disadvantage on D20 tests for 72 hours, whereas this used to cause you to lose up to 10,000 experience points. This could not de-level you, but you would lose up to 10,000. On the other hand, the Jester now grants advantage on D20 tests for 72 hours from gaining 10,000 experience points. The Knight that you get as a servant is now an actual Knight stat block, whereas previously this was a 4th level fighter. It now has the same alignment as you, whereas previously it was the same species as you. And it now states that you can work with your DM to, of course, name and create a backstory for the NPC. And it also states that the DM can use a different stat block to represent the Knight as desired. So like if you're a wizard, for example, and you want like a mage apprentice or something like that, instead of a Knight, then you can have something like that instead. Moving on to the Puzzle, again, this was formerly the Idiot. It can now optionally affect your wisdom instead, whereas previously this could only affect your intelligence. And then for the Ruin card, it now also specifies that you lose your Bastion if you're using the Bastion system. And that is also covered in all the Bastion descriptions as well. And I did a whole video about Bastions as well. Again, I don't know how many cards or things I can link down in the description below, but you can always search on my channel if you want to find out more about them. Moving on to the final page of changes. So the Sage, again, formerly the Vizier, no longer specifies that the knowledge of the answer comes with the wisdom of how to use it. So I guess the DM is allowed to be a little more cryptic there. I don't know why they necessarily removed that text. The Skull now states that the Avatar of Death now appears as close to you as possible, whereas previously this was just within 10 feet. And you and your allies can only summon one Avatar of Death each as a result of this card, whereas previously this was unlimited. So basically how it works is that you summon your Avatar of Death, you're the one who needs to attack it and kill it. If anyone else deals damage to it, they summon their own Avatar of Death, and the same rules apply. Previously, there was no restriction on how many could be summoned this way, so it's possible to just summon an unlimited number of Avatars of Death. So now there's an actual restriction on it. Moving on to the Sun card, this is now any magic item, whereas previously in 2014, this was a wondrous item specifically. It is now chosen by the DM, whereas previously this was randomly chosen by the DM, and the effect now grants you 10 temporary hit points daily until you die, whereas previously this just granted you 50,000 experience. The Throne card now offers you proficiency and expertise in your choice of history, insight, intimidation, or persuasion, whereas previously this was only applied to persuasion. And then for the Void, it now states that your body is inert and doesn't age or require food or air or water anymore, whereas previously you were just incapacitated. Some additional notes about the Avatar of Death. The Avatar of Death has the following changes that haven't been reflected in D&D Beyond, which is again a little annoying, but it is in the new Dungeon Master's Guide. So it no longer has dark vision, it no longer has immunity to turn undead effects. However, it does have immune to the frightened condition, and part of the turn undead effects is the frightened condition as well as incapacitated. So it can be incapacitated, it just can't be frightened by turn undead. It now has a proficiency bonus equal to the summoner's bonus, and it has a multi-attack equal to half its proficiency bonus rounded up. Moving on to the Defender. This is mostly unchanged, but remember, because it is a weapon, it now inherits whatever mastery property comes with whatever weapon type it can be. This can be any type of melee weapon, so there's a lot of different masteries that could apply. I don't think there's a lot of huge synergies between the masteries and this item specifically. I think Graze might be a standout because Graze does damage if you miss, and this allows you to turn your attack bonus into armor class. So you're more likely to miss if you do that, but if you do miss, you still are able to do damage. So there's some synergy there, of course. And of course, Graze is only on the big two-handed weapons. So if you are using those weapons, you can basically give you the bonus as if you are wearing a shield while still being able to use that two-handed weapon. Moving on to Demon Armor. This can now be any armor type, whereas previously this was only plate. And the damage of the claws from the gauntlets is no longer considered magical damage because, of course, all bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing magical damage was removed in 2024. Moving on to the Demonomicon of Igwilf. This one was a two-parter. It was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. The Abyssal reference in Tasha's was renamed to Abyssal Lore. This now grants advantage on those checks instead of expertise. And then, of course, like I mentioned about, I think it was the Book of Vile Darkness, also has a feature similar to this one. According to the book rules and the adventuring gear in the 2024 Player's Handbook, you get a +5 bonus to those checks when referring to a nonfiction book about that topic. So not only do you have advantage on the check, not only do you get a +5 bonus to that check, but you can also apply whatever proficiencies or expertises to that check that you're making on that as well. So there's a lot of good things that stack up with that one feature. The containment feature of this book now requires the magic action to attempt to trap a fiend or for the fiend to try to release you from possession, whereas previously this was just an action. For the second half, there's only one small change here. It is a magic action to cast the spell from a book, from an action, of course. No surprises there. Moving on to Dimensional Shackles. This now uses the Utilize action to place the shackles on a creature or remove them, whereas previously this was just an action. For the Dragon Scale Mail, this no longer provides advantage on saving throws against a dragon's frightful presence, and is now also a magic item to activate the effect of this armor from an action. I think it's a little unfortunate that they removed the saving throws against the frightful presence from this and didn't even replace it with anything else. But they did mention in the Monster Manual preview video about dragons that each dragon type has their own kind of presence now. They could have easily just said you have advantage on saving throws against breath weapons of dragons and their associated presence as well. You know, some better wording of that. And so again, it's a little sad to see that removed and not replaced with anything else. I think it's still very worth being a very rare item, but just sad to see that go. Moving on to the Dragon Slayer, this can be any simple or martial weapon, whereas previously this was just any sword. This used to say that the word dragon refers to any creature with the dragon creature type, but I think that's pretty implicit. And this weapon would of course also come with whatever mastery is associated with that weapon. When it comes to the different creature type, this would mean that it also of course applies to wyverns, because those are dragons. The dragon turtle is listed as a dragon creature type. Notably, they also changed creature types, such as a kobold is now listed as a kind of dragon, so this would now do more damage to a kobold. As for any synergies with certain masteries, I don't really know. Maybe I think push and cleave might be possibly the worst, simply because dragons are usually very large creatures, and it's unlikely for you to have two creatures in range at the same time. And also because push has a size limit of large or smaller, and you're going to be fighting probably huge or gargantuan creatures when you're fighting dragons. Maybe if you're a world tree barbarian, you can use the cleave feature because you have such a large reach. But outside of that, I don't know what other masteries you'd be wanting to look for, besides any of them, of course. You know, most masteries are pretty good. Moving on to the Dread Helm, this was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, but it is unchanged. For the Drift Globe, it now says that you command it rather than saying the word command word. I don't think there's any real mechanical difference. I just thought it was weird that they didn't include the word command word, since they've been so pretty good about including specific keywords where they can. And of course, it is now a magic action to make the Drift Globe float, whereas previously this was just an action. For the Dust of Disappearance, this is now the utilize action to use, whereas previously this was just an action. So again, thief rogues can rejoice. The area of it is now considered an emanation, so there's no mechanical change. And then the invisibility granted by this magic item now ends early if you deal damage, in addition to making an attack roll or casting a spell. For the Dust of Dryness, this is now just a utilize action from an action. So again, thief rogues can rejoice. A similar vein, the Dust of Sneezing and Choking. Again, a utilize action from an action. You know it. I don't need to say it. The affected area is an emanation. No mechanical change there. And it now mentions that constructs, oozes, elementals, plants, and undead automatically succeed on the same, whereas previously this had no mention of such a thing. And notably, it doesn't say that creatures who don't need to breathe aren't affected by this. Rather, it just mentions certain creature types. So I know there are some player species that you can be that don't need to breathe, like I don't know if it's the Dampier or the Reborn, or both of them I think don't need it. Neither of them are considered undead, or at least aren't currently. So we'll see how that goes, but technically I guess if you don't need to breathe, then you could still technically be affected by this. Moving on to Dwarven Plate, this can now be half plate, which is a medium type of armor, whereas previously this was only plate armor. For the Dwarven Thrower, this can now also be attuned by any creature wearing the belt of Dwarven kind. This part of the description is missing in D&D Beyond, which again was very annoying, but that is written in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 2024. And of course, because this is a Warhammer, it now also has the push mastery, so a thrown hammer with the push mastery, that is pretty strong because you can do that from range. For the Earhorn of Hearing, this was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, but it is otherwise unchanged. Moving on to the Ifriti bottle, it no longer states the weight of an object, whereas previously this was listed as 1 pound. It is a magic action to remove the stopper, whereas previously this was an action. You now roll a d10 to determine the results, whereas previously this was a d100, although the overall odds of rolling each thing are the same. And then when you roll a d10 and the Ifriti is allowed to cast Wish, they can only cast Wish once for you, whereas previously they gave you 3 wishes. Moving on to the Ifriti Chain, this can now be a chain shirt, which is a kind of medium armor, whereas previously this was only chainmail. For the Elemental Gem, this is now a utilize action to activate from an action. So again, if you know, you know. This now summons an elemental from effectively casting Conjure Elemental, and because it is no longer casting that specific spell, it now has its own rules for how the elemental behaves, whereas it previously would have just followed the rules of Conjure Elemental. This was the same for like the Brazier of Fire Elemental Summoning, or the Censer of Air Elementals, those similar items. They all have similar mechanics like this. Moving on to the Elixir of Health, this now cures any magical contagions afflicting the drinker, whereas previously this said diseases. It still says diseases on D&D Beyond, which again is annoying, but in the actual physical book of the Dungeon Master's Guide, it specifically says magical contagions instead of diseases. Moving on to the Elven Chain, this now applies to chainmail, which is a kind of heavy armor from only a chain shirt. You are also considered proficient with it, even if you lack training in heavy armor, whereas previously this only applied to medium armor. It is noteworthy that this doesn't supersede the strength requirement to wear heavy armor, so chainmail requires a strength of 13 to not have your speed reduced while wearing it. For the Enduring Spellbook, this was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, but it is otherwise unchanged. The Energy Bow was a new item added to the Dungeon Master's Guide. This was based on the magical bow from the Dungeons & Dragons old cartoon. You can either pause to read this one, or again, I have a whole video about all the new magic items in the Dungeon Master's Guide that you can look up on my channel. And speaking of new magic items, We have the Enspelled Armor, the Enspelled Staff, and the Enspelled Weapon. Each of these items is allowed to store a certain spell in them of a certain level depending on its rarity. Notably, the Enspelled Staff, which can be counted as a quarterstaff, and of course the Enspelled Weapon would of course inherit any mastery properties associated with that weapon. And then for what spell levels are associated with which rarity, you can see that here. We can see that uncommon is cantrips in first level, rare is second and third level, very rare is fourth and fifth level spells, and then legendary is sixth level spells and above, and there are no ninth level spells that you can store in these items. Moving on to Ursat's Eye. This was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Now states that you can see through it as if it was your natural eye from a normal eye, and it is now a magic action to insert or remove the eye, whereas previously this wasn't part of the description. I think the intended difference from saying your natural eye from a normal eye is to maybe help dispel any arguments that might arise that whether or not the eye has dark vision, if you also have dark vision, or has any of those, sight-based senses that you could have. Moving on to the Ever-Smoking Bottle, it is now a magic action to open or close the bottle, whereas previously this was an action, and it also required a command word to close, which it no longer does. It no longer specifies the weight of the bottle, which was previously 1 pound. The cloud is now considered an emanation, where there's no mechanical change there, but they added that keywording. It no longer states that the cloud persists as long as it is open, but it is implicit by the description of how this thing functions. Closing the bottle now causes the cloud to become fixed in place, whereas previously that was not part of the description, so normally that emanation is following you around as long as you're carrying the bottle, but as soon as you put that stopper back in the bottle, then that emanation stops being centered on you and is then fixed in place. It also now suggests that the Gust of Wind spell is a strong enough wind to disperse the smoke, whereas previously it described a moderate wind being 11 to 20 miles per hour and a strong wind being 21 or more miles per hour. And as a result of being affected by a strong enough gust of wind, such as the Gust of Wind spell, the cloud disperses after 1 minute regardless of the wind's strength, whereas previously this was a 1 minute dispersal for a medium wind or 1 round for a strong wind, but now it's just 1 minute regardless. Moving on to the Executioner's Axe. This was another new item that was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide in 2024. Of course, much like every other weapon in the Dungeon Master's Guide now, it will have the mastery property of whatever mastery is associated with that weapon. Moving on to the Eye and Hand of Vecna. This one is a 4-parter. In the first section of these magic items, there are no changes. Notably, they did remove a lot of the background sort of flavor text for this item. However, I think a lot of that was probably moved to the lore index in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Moving on to the features of the eye, the true sight that the eye grants is now limited to 240 feet, whereas previously this didn't have a particular limit on it. The X-ray vision itself isn't new, but the description has pretty substantially changed. So this used to act as a ring of X-ray vision, but now it just has explicit mechanics listed out. So it is a magic action to activate from an action. It is a 30-foot range for 1 minute, and it specifies how much of what kind of material you can see through. Moving on to the properties of the hand. The only change here is that when you try to cast a spell from the hand and that hand casts suggestion on you, the suggestion cast by the hand no longer requires concentration, whereas previously that wasn't part of the description, but again was implicit. And something maybe of note here is that the Icy Touch was not updated to include unarmed strikes. It still only includes melee spell attacks and melee attacks made with a weapon, so this doesn't include unarmed strikes. Then for the shared properties of the eye and the hand, if you are attuned to both of them at the same time, this now has danger sense where you have advantage on initiative rolls. This used to say that you just aren't able to be surprised, but of course the surprise condition doesn't really exist in the same way that it does anymore. So now you just have a blanket advantage on all initiative rolls, which is great. The necrotic reduction is based on an older feature. It works very similarly, but it's a bit different. So it is a magic action from just an action. It requires a saving throw, whereas previously you had to make an attack roll, hit with it, and then they needed to make a saving throw. It now deals damage to the creature rather than just dropping the creature to 0 if they fail that saving throw. It no longer requires the creature to have a skeleton, and it now specifies that non-magical items that were carried by the creature are immediately destroyed by the slime transformation. And then lastly, for the poison immunity, it no longer states that you are immune to disease because of course disease mechanics were removed in 2024. Moving on to the Eyes of Charming. This is no longer an action to use, but of course this is implied by the act of casting a spell, which requires the magic action. This also now allows you to upcast the Charm Person spell from the Eyes of Charming by using more charges per spell level above 1 that you want to cast it at. So that's pretty cool too. They didn't need to do that. For the Eyes of Minute Seeing, this now grants dark vision within the given range, whereas previously this was only advantage on intelligence investigation checks. The Figurine of Wondrous Power, this one is a 4-parter. It is now a magic action to activate and deactivate from an action. It also used to require a command word to deactivate, and it doesn't do that anymore. The creature created by the figurine now acts after you on your initiative count, whereas previously that was not part of the description. For one of the rare versions of it, the Ebony Fly, the giant fly stat block is now considered to have a CR of 0, a proficiency bonus of 2, whereas previously that was not part of the description at all. For the Goat of Terror, it has a number of changes. So first things first, the horns are now removed harmlessly, whereas previously it did not say harmlessly in the description. Removing one of the Goat of Terror's horns is now a magic action from an action. The Goat of Terror's frightening aura is now considered an emanation, but there's no real mechanical change there. And the frightened condition imposed by the Goat of Terror's aura now also ends if you are no longer riding the goat, whereas previously it only ended after 1 minute, or if the goat returned to the figurine form, or if the creature saved on the saving throw, of course. For the marble elephant, it is no longer defined as having any specific dimensions, whereas previously it was 4 inches high and 4 inches long, but it is described as a trumpeting elephant, whereas previously that wasn't in the description. For the Obsidian Steed, this now has a general 10% chance to ignore your orders, whereas previously this only happened if you were a good aligned creature. The Onyx Dog now has blind sight, whereas previously it just had dark vision and the ability to see invisible creatures within that range. And then finally, the Silver Raven no longer states that you can cast Animal Messenger on it at will, but this is implied by the lack of restrictions on the description of that particular figurine. Moving on to the Flame Tongue weapon, so this can now be any melee weapon from any sword previously. The flames now also go away if you stow the weapon, whereas previously this was only if you used the bonus action to do it, if you dropped it, or if you sheathed it. And of course, like every other weapon, it now comes with whatever mastery is associated with whichever weapon this is on. And because of that, I think the most sort of tried and true version of the Flame Tongue, which was the Flame Tongue Greatsword as sort of the best version of this item. It might not be the most powerful version of it. You know, the Flame Tongue Maul would have the topple mastery in addition to all the properties of the Flame Tongue, whereas the Greatsword again just has graze, and the additional damage from the Flame Tongue wouldn't apply to the graze damage, whereas a mastery like the Cleave mastery gives you the opportunity to have extra attack that you normally wouldn't, that is applying that extra damage. Similarly, if you have a Flame Tongue Nick weapon, that gives you 1 extra attack with it from the Nick property. This also combos very well with the Dual Wielder feat that gives you an additional attack with a weapon as a bonus action. So for example, if you had a Flame Tongue Nick weapon, you would make your first attack with the non-Flame Tongue light weapon, then you would make all other attacks on your turn with the Flame Tongue weapon, the Nick weapon, the extra attack if you have it, your bonus action attack from Dual Wielder, or whatever other attacks you can make with a weapon on your turn can all be made with the Flame Tongue weapon. So I thought that was just pretty cool and worth pointing out. It's not necessarily better than the Greatsword or the Maul, for example, but I just think that it's interesting to point out how the different masteries work with these different weapons. And then for the last item in this video, we have the Folding Boat, a very, very exciting one. This is now a magic action to use from an action. The rowboat and the keelboat are no longer listed as having dimensions, whereas previously they have the dimensions listed here on the screen. It does mention that the player's handbook has the statistics for the rowboat and the keelboat, and it also mentions if either vessel is reduced to 0 hit points, the folding boat is destroyed, which was not part of the description before. So the player's handbook does include the stats for these different boats. It doesn't mention the size, but it also doesn't really need to. It does mention things like the speed, the number of crew members that are needed to make it go, the number of other passengers it can contain, how much cargo space it can have, its AC, hit points, as well as any damage thresholds it would have. And again, I did mention earlier in this video that I have a whole video about breaking objects in 5th edition, specifically as it relates to weapons and armor. And I did point out there that magic items also have resistance to all damage per the rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide. In addition to just being an object, it is immune to psychic and poison as well. So even though this can be destroyed, it is a little more durable than just kind of a mundane keelboat or a mundane rowboat because it has all those resistances. But that is all the magic item changes that I'm going to include in this video. Again, this is kind of an ongoing series. Again, I already know what my video is for this weekend is going to be. But if you missed any of the previous videos, or if you are viewing this later on and there are future videos already, again, you'll be able to find all those in a playlist down in the description or on my channel page. Let me know what you think about any of the changes to the magic items that are covered in this video. Which one is your favorite? Are there any sort of cool combinations that I missed? You can let me know all that down in the comments down below. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you're a new or returning viewer to this channel and you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, consider hitting that now if you liked what you saw and you want to see more. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate all your time, and I'll see you in the next one.